A Street View update shows a car peeking from bushes, missing for 17 years. The mouse cursor trembled under Leo's finger, a tiny white arrow quivering against the digital asphalt of a forgotten road. It was 2 a.m. The only light in his cramped apartment came from the glow of his monitor, casting long, dancing shadows that made the stacks of old tech magazines look like sleeping beasts. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just escaping. He'd been scrolling through the backroads of his hometown, a place he hadn't physically visited in over a decade, letting the seamless, sterile glide of Google Street View be his time machine. It was a form of digital self-harm, tracing the routes he used to bike with his older brother, Daniel. Before the world had cracked open and swallowed him whole, he clicked, and the world lurched forward. Click. A blur of sun-bleached mailboxes. Click. The skeletal remains of a barn, its roof a gaping mouth open to the sky. He was on Sycamore Creek Road now, a winding strip of pavement that hugged the edge of the dense, suffocating woods his mother always called the Gloomwood. Even through the screen, he could almost smell it, the damp, loamy scent of decay and secrets. His heart did a familiar, painful stutter step. This was Daniel's road. The last road. Leo's breath hitched. He was about to click away, to retreat back to the relative safety of the main highway, when something caught his eye. A flicker of unnatural color behind a thicket of overgrown azalea bushes, their waxy green leaves swallowing everything. It was a patch of faded blue, almost perfectly camouflaged. He dragged the little yellow Street View man, dropping him a few feet back, trying to get a different angle. The camera perspective shifted, the world warping and stretching for a nauseating second before snapping back into focus. There it was. Unmistakable, the rear corner of a van, a 1988 Ford Econoline, to be exact. The same shade of robin's egg blue as the one Daniel had poured his entire life savings into. The one he'd called the Wanderer. Leo's blood went cold. The kind of cold that starts in your marrow and seeps outward, freezing you from the inside. He could see the distinctive curve of the fender, the edge of a bumper sticker that had been peeled away, leaving a ghostly white rectangle. And just above it, peeking through a gap in the leaves, was a sliver of the custom-painted mural Daniel had been so proud of, the tail of a fiery phoenix, its feathers rendered in scorching oranges and yellows. 17 years. 17 years. Of silence. 17 years of police reports that went nowhere, of private investigators who took their money and offered only shrugs, of his mother's slow, agonizing descent into a grief so profound it had hollowed her out, leaving only a fragile, whispering shell. Daniel hadn't just disappeared, he had evaporated. One moment he was there, laughing, promising to be back by dinner. The next, he was a ghost. A name on a missing persons flyer that yellowed and tore on telephone poles. Leo's hand, slick with sweat, fumbled for the zoom. The image pixelated the beautiful, terrible blue, dissolving into a coarse mosaic. But it was enough. It was the van. He knew it with a certainty that was both terrifying and electrifying. It was tucked away, on a dirt turnout he didn't even know existed. Completely obscured from the road, unless you were looking from this exact, godforsaken digital angle. He checked the capture date at the bottom of the screen. May 2023. Last year, the Google car had driven past it, just last year. It had been sitting there, waiting, his lungs burned, he'd forgotten to breathe. He gasped, a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the silence of his apartment. His gaze darted around the screen, his mind racing, trying to stitch together the impossible. The bushes weren't just overgrown, they were intentionally dense, a living wall. The dirt track leading to it was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path. This wasn't a breakdown. This wasn't a kid who'd pulled over for a nap and never woken up. This was a hiding place. A tomb. A wave of nausea crashed over him. He thought of Daniel, his easy grin, the way he'd ruffle Leo's hair, the smell of grease and paint that always clung to him. He was 17, all lanky limbs and boundless, naive optimism. Leo had been 10, a scrawny, hero-worshipping shadow. That last afternoon was seared into his memory. Daniel, standing by the van, keys dangling from his finger, promising Leo he could help him paint the other side of the Phoenix when he got back. "It's our masterpiece. Little brother," he'd said, his voice full of the easy confidence of a boy who believed the world was his for the taking. "Our legacy?" The word legacy echoed in the silent apartment, mocking him. The legacy was a rotting van in the woods. A 17-year-old ? With a shaking hand, Leo took a screenshot, then another, and another. He saved them to his desktop, his movements jerky, robotic. He had to call someone, the police. What would he say? "I was stalking my dead brother on Google Maps, and I think I found his van." They'd think he was a crank, another grieving relative seeing ghosts in the static. They had dismissed his mother's frantic calls for years, patting her hand and talking about runaways and new lives. They wouldn't listen to him. He had to call his mother. No, he couldn't. The hope would kill her. It would be the cruelest thing he could possibly do, dangling this impossible pixelated clue in front of a woman who had already died 1,000 deaths. Hope was a poison, and she'd had more than her share, so he did the only other thing he could think of. He opened a new tab and typed in a name he hadn't dared to speak in years. A name that tasted like ash and betrayal in his mouth. Sheriff Bill Collier. Collier. The man who had been a deputy back then. The man who had been Daniel's best friend's father. The man who had personally overseen the investigation, his face a mask of practiced sympathy as he told Leo's parents that boys Daniel's age just wandered off sometimes. He was the sheriff now, a pillar of the community, his smiling, sun-weathered face plastered on campaign signs every election cycle. Leo's finger hovered over the search results, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He felt a surge of something hot and dark fury, a fury that had been simmering for 17 years, buried under a mountain of quiet, helpless grief. Collier had been there. He knew Daniel. He knew the van. He knew the family's agony, and he had done nothing. He had closed the case, filed it away, and built a career on the foundations of their unanswered questions. He found the number for the county sheriff's office. He stared at it, the digits blurring through the angry tears that had begun to well in his eyes. This was insane. It was a picture on the internet. It could be anything. A similar van, a trick of the light, a digital ghost. But it wasn't. He knew. In the deepest, most certain part of his soul, he knew. He thought about the phoenix on the van, the mythical bird of rebirth. Daniel had been obsessed with the story, the idea that something beautiful could rise from the ashes. It was a bitter, savage irony. Because as Leo stared at the screen, at the faded blue peeking from its leafy grave, he didn't feel like anything was being reborn. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a tomb that had just been cracked open, and the stench of rot and lies was finally, after 17 long years, beginning to escape. He picked up his phone, his hand steady now, the tremor replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He dialed the number. A dispatcher's bored voice answered on the second ring. Sheriff's Department. Leo opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. He wasn't just reporting a discovery. He was igniting a fuse that had been laid 17 years ago. A fuse that led directly back to the heart of his broken family, to the center of his small, suffocating hometown, and to the men who had sworn to protect it. He was about to demand they look at the ashes, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that they would do anything to stop him from finding out what had started the fire. "Hello," the dispatcher's voice said, impatient now. "Is anyone there?" "Yes," Leo managed, his own voice a stranger's croak. "My name is Leo Sterling. I need to report a crime." He paused, the weight of the next words settling on him like a shroud. "A murder." The line was silent for a beat, the air crackling with unspoken questions. Leo didn't wait for them. He had the screenshot open, the coordinates already copied. He was done being silent. He was done being helpless. He was done letting the ghosts sleep. "And I know who did it," he added. The lie and the truth tangled together in a knot of grief and rage. He didn't know, not for sure, but he knew where. The secret was buried. And he knew who had been standing guard. He stared at the image on his screen, at the sliver of the phoenix's tail. Daniel had wanted a legacy. Maybe, Leo thought with a grim, chilling finality, this was it. Not the masterpiece, but the truth. No matter how ugly it was, no matter who it burned. The silence on the other end of the line was finally broken by the sound of typing. The click-clack of keys that sounded to Leo like the slow, deliberate cocking of a gun. The fuse was lit, and the explosion was coming. He could feel the shockwave already, trembling up from the ground, 17 years late. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since he was a child, he saw his brother's smiling face not as a memory, but as a promise of righteous, terrible fire. Daniel Sterling was sunlight, that's how everyone remembered him. He was the kind of boy who seemed to generate his own warmth, his own light. His smile was a flash of pure, unadulterated joy, and his laughter, a loud, uninhibited bark, could echo down the sterile hallways of Northwood High and make even the most jaded teacher crack a smile. He wasn't just popular, he was loved. He moved through the world with an easy, unthinking grace, his lanky frame always in motion, his hands always busy tinkering with an engine, sketching in a notebook, or, most often, wrapped around the shoulders of his best friend, Jesse Collier. Jesse was Daniel's opposite, his shadow. Where Daniel was bright, Jesse was dark. Where Daniel was open, Jesse was closed. He was quiet, watchful, with eyes that seemed to hold a permanent storm cloud of resentment. He was the son of Bill Collier, a man who cast a shadow as long and imposing as the Gloomwood itself. Bill was a man carved from granite and disappointment. A deputy sheriff who ruled his home with the same iron-fisted authority he wielded on the streets. He saw the world in black and white, in terms of strength and weakness, and in his eyes, his own son was a constant, glaring failure. Jesse's weakness, in Bill's view, was his art. He drew, not the heroic, masculine things Bill might have understood, but strange, beautiful, unsettling things. Twisted trees with human faces, birds with broken wings, boys who looked like fallen angels. It was a language Bill couldn't, or wouldn't, understand. And he punished Jesse for it with a relentless campaign of psychological warfare. His praise was reserved for Daniel. "Look at that sterling boy," he'd say at the dinner table. His voice a low growl of admiration that was a slap in Jesse's face. "That's a real man, strong, confident, knows what he wants." Daniel, in his sun-drenched innocence, was oblivious to the poison seeping into his best friend's soul. He saw Jesse's quietness, not as resentment, but as depth. He saw his art not as weakness, but as a superpower. He championed it, defended it, even tried to emulate it, though his own artistic talent was more bombastic, less nuanced. The phoenix on his van was a testament to that bold, bright, and full of life. A stark contrast to the delicate, sorrowful creatures that populated Jesse's sketchbooks. Their friendship was a strange, unbalanced ecosystem, but it worked. Daniel's light gave Jesse a place to hide from his father's suffocating darkness, and Jesse's quiet intensity grounded Daniel's boundless energy. They were two halves of a whole. Inseparable since kindergarten. Then came Amelia. Amelia Thorne was new to Northwood, a transplant from the city who arrived like a spark in the dry tinder of their small town. She had eyes the color of moss after a rainstorm, and a spirit that was fierce and untamed. She wrote poetry that was sharp and clever. And she wasn't afraid of anything, not the cliché girls who whispered about her second-hand clothes. Not the leering football players, and certainly not the She saw the beauty in its shadows, the same way she saw the beauty in Jesse Collier's haunted drawings. Jesse fell for her instantly. Silently, with the desperate, all-consuming passion of a boy who had never been truly seen before. He filled his sketchbooks with her face, her hands, the way her hair caught the light. He drew her as a forest queen, a warrior, a goddess of the gloom. But he never showed her. He couldn't. The words, like his drawings, were trapped inside him, prisoners of his father's tyranny and his own crippling fear. So he watched from the sidelines as Daniel, his sun god, his golden boy, did what he always Diddy walked right up to Amelia, flashed that 1,000-watt smile, and won her over without even trying. It wasn't malicious. Daniel didn't know about Jesse's silent, agonizing love. He just saw a girl who was as bright and alive as he was, and he was drawn to her light. And Amelia, who had spent her life feeling like an outsider, was drawn to his warmth, his easy acceptance. They fell in love, and their romance was as bright and loud and public as the phoenix on Daniel's van. Jesse watched it all. He watched them hold hands in the hallway. He watched them share milkshakes at the diner. He watched Daniel teach her how to drive the van, her laughter echoing through the open windows. And with every laugh, every shared glance, a piece of Jesse's already fractured soul chipped away. The storm clouds in his eyes grew darker. His drawings became more grotesque. The beautiful, broken birds now had blood on their wings. The fallen angels were impaled on thorns. There was a third person watching this slow-motion tragedy unfold, a silent observer hidden in plain sight. Sarah Jenkins was a ghost in the halls of Northwood High. She was painfully shy, with a stutter that made her a target for the cruel, casual bullying of teenagers. She was the kind of girl people looked through, not at. She ate her lunch alone in the library, her head bowed over a book, her presence as unobtrusive as a speck of dust. But Sarah saw everything. She saw the way Jesse's hand trembled when Amelia walked by. She saw the raw, naked anguish in his eyes when he watched Amelia kiss Daniel. She saw the sketchbook he kept hidden in his locker, the one filled with drawings of a love he was too afraid to claim. She saw it because she felt it. She had been silently but hopelessly in love with Jesse Collier since the day he'd stood up for her in middle school. The one and only time he'd ever used his voice to stop the boys who were mocking her stutter. He was her hero, her dark, silent knight, and she saw Bill Collier. She saw him at the football games, his eyes not on the field, but on Daniel and Amelia in the stands, a strange, predatory glint in his gaze. She saw him pull Jesse aside after school, his hand a vice on his son's shoulder, his voice a low, menacing rumble that made Jesse flinch. She saw the bruises that sometimes bloomed on Jesse's arms, the ones he always covered with long sleeves. Even in the sweltering heat of late spring, Sarah didn't have the words to describe what she was seeing. She didn't understand the complex, toxic dynamics of the Collier family, or the explosive potential of a love triangle built on a foundation of fear and silence. She just knew that something was terribly wrong. It felt like watching the pressure build in a glass jar, the cracks slowly spreading, threatening to shatter everything. The day Daniel disappeared, the pressure finally became too much. It was the last Friday before summer vacation. The air was thick with the promise of freedom. Daniel was planning to take the van on a road trip, a celebratory tour of the coast. He was supposed to take Amelia with him, but they'd had a fight. Their first real one. It was about Jesse. Amelia, with her sharp intuition, had finally started to see the darkness clinging to their perfect romance. She'd seen the way Jesse looked at her, and it had unsettled her. She'd asked Daniel to talk to him, to clear the air, to fix the growing rift between the three of them. "He's your best friend, Danny," she'd pleaded. "But he looks at me like he hates me. And like he loves me. It's scaring me." Daniel, ever the optimist, had brushed it off. "That's just Jesse," he'd said with a wave of his hand. "He's intense. Don't worry about it. I'll talk to him. We'll all go for a drive tonight, clear the air before I leave." He'd driven to the Collier house that afternoon, the Phoenix on his van gleaming in the sun. Sarah Jenkins saw him pull up. She was walking home, taking the long route past Jesse's house, as she sometimes did, just for the chance of a glimpse of him. She saw Daniel knock on the door. She saw Jesse answer, his face pale and drawn. She saw them talk for a moment on the porch, their gestures tense. Then, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks, her heart seizing in her chest. Bill Collier's patrol car was parked in the driveway. He was supposed to be on duty, but he was home, and he was watching his son and Daniel from the living room window, his silhouette, a dark, menacing shape against the light. Sarah felt a prickle of pure, undiluted fear. She wanted to run, to scream, to warn Daniel. But the stutter, the fear, the years of being invisible, paralyzed her. She ducked behind a hedge, her body trembling, and watched as Daniel and Jesse got into the blue van and drove away, heading in the direction of Sycamore Creek Road. She never saw Daniel again. The sunlight was extinguished. The world cracked open. And Sarah Jenkins, the ghost girl, the hidden witness, was left with a secret that was too big, too terrifying to hold. A secret that would fester inside her for 17 years, a silent, screaming testament to the day the gloomwood swallowed the sun. She knew what she had seen. She had seen a boy drive off with his best friend. And she had seen the monster who had let them go, or, she feared, had sent them. The days following Daniel's disappearance were a blur of surreal, suffocating horror. The initial frantic hope that he'd just taken off early for his trip quickly curdled into a thick, choking dread. His mother, Alina, a woman who had always been the vibrant, unshakable center of their family, began to fray at the edges. Her laughter, once a constant, joyful sound in their small house, vanished. It was replaced by a hollow-eyed silence, broken only by her desperate whispered prayers and her increasingly frantic calls to the sheriff's department. The investigation, led by Deputy Bill Collier, was a masterclass in calculated indifference. He projected an air of weary competence, his face a mask of grim but reassuring authority. He visited the Sterling house daily, his large, imposing frame filling their small living room. His voice a low soothing rumble as he delivered his litany of empty promises. "We're doing everything we can, Alina," he'd say, placing a hand on her shoulder that was meant to be comforting but felt, to 10-year-old Leo, like an act of possession. Boys this age, they get restless. He's probably halfway to California by now chasing some girl. He interviewed Jesse, of course. The official story was simple, clean. Jesse claimed Daniel had dropped him off at the edge of the gloomwood, saying he needed to clear his head after his fight with Amelia. He was going for a drive, Jesse said, and would call him later. He never did. It was a plausible, maddeningly simple explanation that left no room for questions. Jesse delivered the story with a quiet, convincing grief, his eyes downcast, his voice soft. He played the part of the heartbroken best friend perfectly. But the injustice was a living thing in the Sterling house. It was in the way Collier would steer the conversation away from the van, away from Sycamore Creek Road, the last place Daniel was supposedly seen. "Kids sell things, Leo," he'd said to the boy once, a condescending smile on his lips, when Leo had insisted Daniel would never abandon the wanderer. "A van like that? It's quick cash. He's probably bought a bus ticket to nowhere." The humiliation was constant. Elena's grief was treated as hysteria. Her intuition, the unshakable certainty of a mother who knew her child, was dismissed as the ramblings of a woman unhinged by sorrow. She would call Collier at all hours, armed with a new theory, a new plea. Had they checked the old quarry? Had they spoken to that boy Daniel had argued with last month? Each time, Collier's patience wore a little thinner, his soothing tone replaced by a sharp edge of annoyance. The town, taking its cue from the sheriff's department, began to whisper. They saw Elena's posters, her desperate, tear-streaked face at the grocery store, and they looked away. It was easier to believe the story of a runaway than to confront the terrifying possibility that something monstrous had happened in their own backyard. For Amelia, the guilt was a physical weight. Collier's investigation had subtly, expertly, painted her as the catalyst. The fight, the reason Daniel had needed to clear his head. She became a pariah at school. The whispers followed her down the hallways, accusing glances thrown like stones. She drove him away. It's her fault. Betrayal came from all sides. Her friends, caught in the crossfire of gossip and fear, distanced themselves. Even Daniel's parents, in the depths of their grief, couldn't look at her without a flicker of pain and blame in their eyes. She tried to fight back. She knew Daniel. He wouldn't have run, not from her, not from a fight. He would have shown up the next morning with a stupid grin and a handful of wildflowers, and everything would have been okay. She told this to Collier, her voice shaking. With conviction, he listened with that same practiced, paternalistic sympathy, then twisted her words. So you're saying he was emotional, he'd summarized in his official notes. Upset. Not thinking clearly. The cruelty of the antagonist, Bill Collier, was not in overt violence, but in his slow, methodical destruction of hope. He wasn't just failing to investigate, he was actively suppressing the truth, burying it under a mountain of bureaucratic apathy and small-town gossip. He was a puppeteer, and the entire town was dancing on his strings. He made Alina the crazy mother, Amelia the troublesome girlfriend, and Daniel the irresponsible runaway. He controlled the narrative, and in doing so, he made himself the hero, the calm, steady hand in a storm of female emotion. Jesse, meanwhile, retreated further into himself. He was a ghost, haunted by a secret he was too terrified to speak. Collier's control over him was absolute. Leo, watching from the periphery, saw it. He saw the way Jesse would flinch when his father entered a room, the way his eyes would dart to Bill for approval before speaking. The Collier house, once a second home to Daniel, became a fortress. The friendship that had defined two childhoods was now a crime scene, cordoned off by fear and lies. One afternoon, about a month after Daniel disappeared, Leo saw Jesse at the creek behind their houses. Jesse was skipping stones, his movements listless, mechanical. Leo, desperate for any connection to his brother, approached him. "Did you see him?" Leo asked, his voice small. "Did he say where he was going?" Jesse froze, his back to Leo. He didn't turn around. "I told you, I told everyone. He dropped me off." "But you were with him," Leo pressed, tears welling in his eyes. "Were his best friend, he would have told you." Jesse's shoulders tensed. He finally turned, and the look on his face shocked Leo. It wasn't grief, it was pure, undiluted terror. His eyes were wide, his skin ashen. He looked like one of the haunted creatures from his own drawings. "Leave it alone, Leo," Jesse whispered, his voice a raw, ragged plea. He took a step closer, his eyes darting around as if he expected his father to materialize from the trees. You have to stop asking questions. It's better this way. It's safer." "Safer for who?" Leo cried. The injustice of it all, choking him. Before Jesse could answer, a shadow fell over them. Bill Collier stood on the bank of the creek, his arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. He hadn't made a sound. "Jesse Collier," said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable threat. "Time to go home." Jesse flinched as if struck. He gave Leo one last, desperate look, a look that screamed 1,000 unspeakable things, then turned and walked away, his head bowed in submission. Collier watched him go, then turned his gaze on Leo. The feigned sympathy was gone. For a split second, Leo saw the real Bill Collier. He saw a man of absolute, chilling authority, a man who would crush anything that stood in his way. The look in his eyes was not of a protector, but of a predator. "Your brother's gone." "Son," Collier said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "The sooner you and your mother accept that, the better it will be for everyone." It wasn't advice, it was a command, a threat. In that moment, 10-year-old Leo Sterling understood. This wasn't an investigation, it was a cover-up. The conflict wasn't between his family and a faceless kidnapper. It was between his family and the man who was supposed to be helping them. The monster wasn't hiding in the Glenwood, he was wearing a sheriff's badge, and he had just warned a child to stop looking for his brother. The fear was suffocating, but beneath it, something else took root in Leo's heart. A seed of cold, hard certainty. A certainty that would lie dormant for 17 years, waiting for a single, pixelated image to give it air, to give it light, to give it a reason to grow into a righteous, consuming fire. The years passed, but the wound never closed. It festered. Alina Sterling, once a pillar of strength, crumbled. She sold the family home, unable to bear the ghost of her son's laughter in its empty rooms, and moved into a small, sterile apartment that always smelled of stale air and disinfectant. Her life shrank until it was contained within those four Walls, her only connection to the outside world, the flickering blue light of a television screen. She collected missing persons flyers from other towns, her maternal grief expanding to embrace all the lost children of the world. A silent, sorrowful vigil for a son the world had forgotten. Leo escaped to the city as soon as he could, putting hundreds of miles between himself and the suffocating atmosphere of Northwood. He buried himself in the cold, clean logic of code, building firewalls and encryption algorithms as if he could retroactively build a fortress around his 10-year-old self, a fortress that could have protected his brother. But the distance was an illusion. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back at that creek, staring into the cold, dead eyes of Bill Collier. The seed of certainty that had been planted that day had grown into a dark, twisted tree in the back of his mind, its roots entangled. With every memory, its branches casting a shadow over every relationship. He was haunted, not by a ghost, but by a question that had no answer. Then came the Google Street View image, the spark. The morning after his late-night discovery, Leo drove. He didn't sleep. He just got in his car and pointed it toward Northwood, the screenshot of the van burning on his phone screen like a holy relic. The 7-hour drive was a fever dream. The world outside his windshield seemed unreal, a flimsy backdrop to the raging storm in his mind. He was no longer a helpless child. He was 34 years old, a man who understood systems, who knew how to find weaknesses. And Bill Collier, now Sheriff Collier, was a system, a corrupt, deeply entrenched system. And Leo was about to launch a full-scale assault. His call to the sheriff's department had been met with a predictable, infuriating wall of bureaucratic indifference. A dismissive sergeant had taken his name, his number, and a garbled version of his story, promising that someone would look into it. Leo knew what that meant. It meant the report would be buried before the ink was dry. He needed leverage. He needed an ally. He needed someone else who had been left bleeding on the battlefield of Bill Collier's ambition. He found her in a rundown bookstore on the edge of town, a place called The Last Word. Amelia Thorne had never left Northwood. She had stayed. A quiet act of defiance. The town had tried to brand her, to make her the Scarlet Woman in their tidy narrative of Daniel's disappearance. But she had refused to be erased. She had inherited the bookstore from her grandmother, and it had become her sanctuary, a fortress built of paper and ink. When Leo walked in, the little bell above the door chiming softly, she looked up from behind the counter. The years had changed her, but her eyes were the same, the color of moss, and just as deep. They held a flicker of recognition, then a wave of caution. "Leo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Amelia," he breathed, the name feeling strange on his tongue. After so long, he held up his phone, his hand shaking slightly, and showed her the screen. "I found it." She stared at the image, at the faded blue of the van peeking through the leaves. Her face went pale. The book she was holding slipped from her fingers, and landed on the floor with a soft thud. She didn't seem to notice. Her hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and something else, something that looked terrifyingly like hope. "Where?" she whispered, her gaze locked on the screen. "Sycamore Creek Road, hidden. It's been there the whole time." The carefully constructed walls she had built around herself for 17 years began to crumble. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of a fierce, vindicated rage. "I told them," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I told them he would never leave the van. I told them to search the woods. He wouldn't listen." "He didn't want to listen," Leo said, his voice hard. "He wanted it gone. He wanted Daniel gone." That night, they sat in the back of the bookstore, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 stories, and for the first time, they pieced together their own. Leo told her about the creek, about Collier's threat. Amelia told him about the fight, about her fear of Jesse's obsessive gaze, about how Collier had twisted her words, using her love for Daniel as a weapon against her. As they talked, the disjointed fragments of their individual griefs began to coalesce into a single, horrifying picture. They needed more. They needed the one person who knew what happened that day. They needed Jesse. Finding Jesse was harder. He no longer lived with his father, He had a small, dilapidated studio on the other side of the county, a place that smelled of turpentine and despair. He made a meager living selling his strange, unsettling paintings at local art fairs, but mostly, he drank. He was a wraith, a man hollowed out by the secret he carried. When Leo and Amelia knocked on his door, he answered it, looking like a man who had already seen a ghost. His eyes, sunken and bloodshot, widened in terror when he saw them. "What do you want?" he slurred, his hand tightening on the doorframe. "The truth, Jesse," Amelia said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's time." "There's nothing to tell," he mumbled, trying to shut the door. Leo put his foot in the way. "We found the van, Jesse," Leo said, his voice cold as ice. "On Sycamore Creek Road, the Google car got a picture. It's over." The color drained from Jesse's face. He stumbled back, his eyes darting around the squalid studio, as if looking for an escape. He looked at Amelia, and for a moment, Leo saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, the boy who had loved her with a silent, desperate passion. "He'll kill me," Jesse whispered, his body trembling. "You don't understand, he'll kill me." "He's been killing you for 17 years, Amelia said softly. Slowly, "Isn't it time to stop letting him?" Jesse began to sob, great racking sobs that shook his entire body. He sank to the floor, his face in his hands, and the story, the real story, finally came out. A torrent of poison that had been dammed up for nearly 2 decades. He told them everything. He told them about the fight with Daniel, how he'd finally confessed his love for Amelia, and how Daniel, shocked and hurt, had tried to reason with him. He told them how they'd driven out to Sycamore Creek Road, to talk, to yell, to figure it out, and he told them how they hadn't been alone. His father had followed them. Bill Collier, enraged that his son was causing problems for the Golden Boy, had confronted them. He hadn't come as a father or a peacekeeper, he had come as an executioner of his son's spirit. He had belittled Jesse, called him weak, pathetic, a disgrace. Daniel, ever the loyal friend, had stood up to him. He'd defended Jesse, told Collier to leave him alone. Told him he was a bully and a coward, and that had been his mistake. No one stood up to Bill Collier, he hit him. Jesse choked out, the words tearing from his throat. He just hit him with a tire iron from the back of his patrol car. Daniel, he just fell, he didn't get up. The bookstore was silent, the only sound, Amelia's sharp, horrified gasp. "My dad," he panicked. Jesse continued, his voice a dead monotone. He said it was an accident. That Daniel had provoked him. That it was my fault, for being weak, for starting it all. He said we had to hide him. That it was the only way to protect me. To protect our family. He described the nightmare that followed, pushing the van deep into the overgrown turnout. His father's cold, methodical instructions guiding his numb, trembling hands. He told them how his father had coached him, drilled him on the story he was to tell, threatening him, reminding him that he was an accomplice now. If one of them went down, they both went down. The conspiracy wasn't just a cover-up of a disappearance. It was the cover-up of a murder. A murder committed by a sheriff's deputy. A man who had then orchestrated the entire investigation to protect himself, sacrificing his own son's soul in the process. But the final, most sickening twist was yet to come. As Jesse's confession wound down, he reached into a battered portfolio leaning against the wall. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely open it. He pulled out a single large sheet of drawing paper, yellowed and stained with age. He had drawn it, the entire scene, not as a confession, but as the only way he knew how to process the horror. It was a nightmare in charcoal and graphite. The blue van, half hidden by monstrous claw-like trees. The figure of Daniel lying on the ground, a dark halo spreading from his head. And standing over him, a towering figure of pure menace, his face obscured by shadow but his sheriff's uniform clearly visible, a tire iron dangling from his hand. In the corner of the drawing, almost hidden in the cross-hatching, was a smaller figure. A boy with his own face, watching, his hands covering his mouth in a silent scream. It was a confession, a 17-year-old, illustrated confession. The hidden clue that changed everything. But there was one more detail in the drawing, a detail that made Leo's blood run cold. In the background, peeking from behind a tree, was another face. A small, terrified face with wide, frightened eyes, and a mouth open in a silent O of shock. "Who is that?" Amelia whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the drawing. Jesse looked at the face, his own expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. I don't know," he stammered. I felt like we were being watched. I always felt it. I thought it was a ghost. A spirit of the woods. So I drew it in." Leo stared at the face. He knew that face. He had seen it 100 times in the hallways of Northwood High. A face that always looked away. A face that never wanted to be seen. Sarah Jenkins. The ghost girl. The stutterer. She had been there. She had seen it all. The conspiracy wasn't just between a father and a son. There was a witness. A hidden, silent witness who had been carrying the truth for 17 years, locked away behind a wall of fear and a crippling stutter. The stakes had just shifted. This was no longer just about getting justice for Daniel. It was about rescuing 2 more victims who had been buried alive by Bill Collier's lies, his own son, and the terrified girl who had seen him become a monster. The revelation that Sarah Jenkins was a witness sent a jolt of adrenaline through the small group huddled in Jesse's studio. It transformed the landscape of their grief and anger. This was no longer Jesse's word against his father's. It was a memory, a drawing, and now, a potential eyewitness. The thought of it was both electrifying and terrifying. Sarah had been a ghost for 17 years. Forcing her into the light could be an act of cruelty, or it could be their only hope. Leo took the lead. His mind, trained to see patterns and pathways, immediately began to strategize. "We can't go to her," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Collier has eyes and ears everywhere in this town. If he gets so much as a whiff that we're talking to her, she'll disappear, or worse, he'll get to her first. He'll intimidate her, convince her she's crazy, that she He looked at Jesse, whose trembling had subsided into a state of numb shock. "He's done it before, he's an expert at it." Amelia nodded, her face grim. "He's right, we have one shot at this. We need to bring her to us, and we need proof. Something undeniable, something that protects her the moment she decides to speak." The plan was audacious, born of desperation and 17 years of suppressed rage. They would use Collier's own power, his own arrogance, against him. The town was preparing for its annual Founders' Day festival, a saccharine celebration of Northwood's history. Sheriff Bill Collier, as he did every year, would be the master of ceremonies, the benevolent patriarch presiding over the festivities. He would be on a stage in the town square, a microphone in his hand, his authority on full display. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. Their weapon would be Jesse's confession. But a verbal confession was fleeting, deniable. They had needed to capture it. Leo, the tech expert, knew how. He spent the next 24 hours in a frenzy of activity, turning Amelia's bookstore into a makeshift command center. He bought a series of high-fidelity, easily concealable audio recorders and a powerful directional microphone. The plan was to wire Jesse and record him confronting his father. To capture Collier's reaction, his threats, his denial, or, if they were lucky, his admission. The hardest part was convincing Jesse. He was a broken man, teetering on the edge of a complete collapse. The idea of confronting his father was like asking a man with shattered legs to climb a mountain. "I can't," he whispered, huddled in a corner of the bookstore, the charcoal drawing clutched in his hand like a talisman. "He'll know. The moment I walk in, he'll know I betrayed him. He can see it in my eyes." It was Amelia who reached him. She sat beside him, not touching him, but lending him her strength. "He's taken everything from you, Jesse," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "He took your friend, he took your voice, he took your soul, and locked it in a box for 17 years. This isn't about betraying him. This is about reclaiming what's yours. It's for Daniel. And it's for the boy you were before he turned you into this." She gestured around. "The squalid studio of his life. You have to do this, or you will be his prisoner forever." Her words, and the raw, unvarnished truth in them, finally broke through his fear. He looked at the drawing, at the image of his younger self, mouth open in a silent scream. He finally, after all these years, wanted to make a sound. He agreed. While Leo prepared the tech, Amelia took on the most delicate task, contacting Sarah Jenkins. She found her working at the county records office, a fitting place for a ghost, surrounded by the dusty, forgotten histories of other people. Sarah was even quieter, more withdrawn than she had been in high school. The years had not been kind. She flinched when Amelia said her name, her eyes immediately darting to the floor. Amelia didn't push. She didn't mention the murder. She simply handed Sarah a small folded note. "I think you dropped this," she said gently, and walked away. Inside the note, Amelia had written a single sentence. "I know you saw what happened in the glue." Below it was an address, not the bookstore, but a neutral location, a quiet cafe in the next town over and a time. It was a gamble, a terrifying high-stakes gamble on a woman's 17-year-old conscience. For 2 days, they heard nothing. The silence was agonizing. Leo and Amelia barely slept, running through the plan again and again. The tension in the bookstore thick enough to choke on. On the morning of the Founders' Day festival, just as they were beginning to lose hope, Amelia's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. A text message with a single word dot. Yes, the cinematic payoff was set for that evening, under the twinkling fairy lights of the town square. The entire town was there, a sea of smiling, oblivious faces. On stage, Sheriff Bill Collier was in his element. His voice booming through the speakers, a portrait of civic pride and unassailable authority. He was telling an anecdote about the town's founding fathers, his words dripping with a folksy charm that made Leo's stomach turn. The plan was in motion. Jesse, pale but resolute, was wearing one of Leo's audio recorders, a tiny device clipped to the inside of his jacket. He was to approach his father backstage just before the final fireworks display, under the pretense of congratulating him. Leo was positioned in the crowd. A directional microphone disguised as a local news camera pointed directly at the backstage area. Amelia was waiting in a car a block away with Sarah Jenkins, who had arrived at the cafe pale and trembling, but with a look of fierce, terrified resolve in her eyes. Jesse walked toward the stage, each step an act of monumental courage. He slipped behind the curtain. Leo focused the microphone, his heart pounding in his ears. He could hear the muffled sound of Collier's speech, then the applause. Then, he heard Collier's voice, no longer the folksy patriarch, but the cold, hard tyrant. "What the hell are you doing here?" Collier hissed. "You're drunk, you're embarrassing me." "I'm not drunk, Dad." Jesse's voice came through the earpiece, miraculously steady. "I need to talk to you. We have nothing to talk about. Get out of here before you make a scene." "It's about Daniel," Jesse said, his voice dropping lower. They found the van. There was a beat of pure, dead silence. Leo held his breath. The recording was crystal clear. "What did you say?" Collier's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "A Google car," Jesse said, his voice starting to shake. "It took a picture. They know where it is. They're going to find him." "Who's they?" Collier demanded, his voice laced with panic. "Who have you been talking to?" "That Thorne girl, the Sterling boy." "It doesn't matter," Jesse pushed on, his voice gaining strength. "It's over, Dad. We have to tell them what happened." Collier laughed, a short, ugly, humorless sound. There is no we. You are going to keep your mouth shut, just like you have for 17 years. You think anyone is going to believe a drunk, washed-up loser like you over me? I am this town. I will crush you. I will put you in a mental institution. I will tell them you were obsessed with the girl, that you killed Daniel in a jealous rage and you've finally cracked. Who do you think they'll believe? It was more than they could have hoped for. A confession wrapped in a threat. A perfect portrait of the monster behind the badge. "They'll believe the witness," Jesse said, playing his final card. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. Leo could practically feel the gears turning in Collier's mind. The frantic search for an explanation. There was no witness. Collier snarled, but for the first time, there was a tremor of fear in his voice. Sarah Jenkins, Jesse said, the name dropping like a stone into the silence. She saw you, Dad. She saw you with the tire iron. Leo didn't wait to hear any more. He gave the signal. On the other side of the square, a large projector, which had been set up to show a historical slideshow, flickered to life. But, instead of black and white photos of the town's founders, a single massive image filled the screen. Jesse's drawing. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The charcoal nightmare of the blue van, the fallen boy, and the menacing uniformed figure loomed over the festive square. Time seemed to slow down. Faces turned from the stage to the screen, confusion morphing into dawning horror. Then, Leo hit play. The audio from the backstage confrontation, amplified through the festival's own sound system, blasted through the town square. Collier's voice, raw and vicious, filled the night air. His threats, his confession, his contempt for his own son, echoed off the brick buildings. The crowd was frozen, a tableau of shock and disbelief. On stage, Bill Collier's face went white. He turned from Jesse and saw the drawing, saw the hundreds of faces staring at him. Their expressions of adoration now twisted into masks of revulsion. He was trapped, exposed in a spotlight of his own making. The audio recording reached its climax with Jesse's final damning words, "She saw you, Dad. She saw you with the tire iron." As if on cue, a single figure walked out from the side of the stage. It was Sarah Jenkins. She was no longer a ghost. She was flesh and blood, her face pale but her eyes burning with a righteous fire. She walked to the microphone that Collier had just abandoned. The crowd was utterly silent, a city holding its breath. Sarah looked out at the sea of faces, the people who had looked through her for her entire life. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and then, without a single stutter, her voice clear and strong and ringing with the weight of 17 years of silence, she began to speak. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she said, "and I am the witness." The explosion was not of fireworks, but of truth. It was the sound of a town's foundation cracking, of a monster being unmasked, of a 17-year-old secret screaming its way into the light. Bill Collier stood frozen for a moment, his empire of lies crumbling around him, before two state troopers, alerted by Leo just moments before, walked onto the stage and placed him under arrest. The click of the handcuffs was the most satisfying sound Leo had ever heard, a sound that was 17 years overdue. It was the sound of justice. Not the quiet, sterile justice of a courtroom, but a loud, messy, public reckoning. A cinematic, cathartic, and utterly explosive payoff. The aftermath was not a celebration. It was an excavation. The arrest of Sheriff Collier sent a seismic shock through Northwood, cracking the town's placid facade and revealing the rot beneath. The state police took over the investigation, and Sycamore Creek Road became a sprawling crime scene. The blue van, the Wanderer, was finally dragged from its leafy tomb, looking like a relic from another lifetime. When they opened the doors, they found what was left of Daniel Sterling, his remains wrapped in a faded sleeping bag. The phoenix on the van's side, now a peeling, tragic emblem of a life that never had the chance to rise from its own ashes. The funeral was held a week later. The entire town came, their faces a mixture of shame, grief, and morbid curiosity. They were mourning not just a boy they had let themselves forget, but their own willful blindness. Elena Sterling stood at the graveside, supported by Leo and Amelia. The hollowed-out look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking sorrow, but also a sliver of peace. The not knowing, the endless, agonizing question mark that had defined her life for 17 years, was finally gone. She had her son back, if only to lay him to rest. She placed a single, perfect sunflower on the polished wood of the casket, a final tribute to her boy who had been made of sunlight. Jesse Collier was not at the funeral. He had been taken into protective custody, his testimony the cornerstone Of the case against his father, the trial was swift. With Jesse's recorded confession, Sarah's unwavering eyewitness account, and the physical evidence from the van, Bill Collier's conviction was a certainty. He never showed a flicker of remorse, his face a mask of arrogant defiance until the very end. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A fitting end for a man who had imprisoned so many others in his web of lies. After the trial, Jesse was released. He was a free man, but his sentence was a different kind of life imprisonment. He couldn't stay in Northwood, a town that would forever see him as both a victim and an accomplice. The night before he left, he met with Leo and Amelia one last time at the Nafimous bookstore. He looked older, wearier, but the haunted, terrified look in his eyes was gone. He handed Leo the charcoal drawing, the illustrated confession that had started it all. He should have it, Jesse said, his voice quiet. It's his story. Leo took the drawing, his fingers tracing the image of Daniel on the ground. It was a horrific, painful image, but it was also the truth. And the truth, he was learning, was a complicated, messy thing. It didn't heal all wounds, it didn't bring back the dead. But it offered a foundation, however scarred, on which to rebuild. "What will you do now?" Amelia asked, her voice full of a gentle, sisterly concern. Jesse shrugged, a small, sad smile on his lips. "I'm going to drive," he said. "No destination, just drive. And maybe I'll try to draw something beautiful again." He left the next morning, his few belongings packed into a beat-up sedan. Leo and Amelia watched him go. Two survivors of a war they never asked to fight. In the months that followed, a fragile kind of healing began. The bookstore became a hub, a place where people came not just to buy books, but to talk, to process, to remember. Amelia, once the town pariah, was now its heart. She had found her voice, and she used it to make sure no one else's story was ever silenced again. Leo stayed in Northwood. He couldn't go back to his sterile apartment in the city, back to his life of digital firewalls. The fire had been real, and it had burned him clean. He moved in with his mother, and together, they began the slow, painful process of grieving, not for a ghost, but for a boy of flesh and blood. One cool autumn afternoon, Leo drove out to Sycamore Creek Road. The police tape was gone. The dirt turnout was empty. Nature was already reclaiming the space, new growth covering the scars on the land. He walked into the gloomwood, the air cool and damp. He found a small clearing, a place where the sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns. He took out the charcoal drawing Jesse had given him. It was a testament to a terrible crime, a map of their shared trauma. But it was also, in its own way, a work of art. It was truth rendered in shadow and light. He didn't bury it, he didn't burn it, he carefully placed it at the base of a large, ancient oak tree, a final silent memorial at the place where his brother's life had ended. He wasn't leaving it as a tribute to the darkness. He was leaving it as a reminder. A reminder of the cost of silence. A reminder of the courage it takes to speak. A reminder that even in the deepest, darkest woods, a single flicker of lighter patch of faded blue on a computer screen, the unwavering gaze of a hidden witness, the love between two brothers can be enough to burn down the forest of lies and, finally, let the sun in. He turned and walked out of the gloomwood, not looking back, his own face turned toward the light. Ready, at last, to step out of the long, cold shadow of the past. The echo of what was lost would always be there, a haunting whisper on the wind, but it was no longer the only sound. It was now accompanied by the quiet, steady rhythm of a world slowly, painfully, finding its way back to life.